My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we are looking at Paul's doctrine of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, how he deals with the scoffers who were denying the resurrection of those who had died before Jesus. Paul's dealing with those who were denying that Israel would receive her resurrection promises. Go back and see, which I pointed out, that the scoffers at 1 Corinthians at Corinth were denying that Isaiah 25, Hosea 13, Daniel 12, Ezekiel 37 would be fulfilled. That's the denial. Okay, now then, we introduced to you the idea of Christ being the first to be raised from the dead. Of how Paul's positive, emphatic, and specific declaration that Christ was the first fruit of those who had fallen asleep before him. He said in Acts 26:21, Christ was the first to be raised from the dead. Now look, folks, let me reiterate this. This is so critically important. Jesus was not the first person to be raised from physical death. Is that not self-evident? And people want to argue, well, what Paul's really saying there is that he was the first to be raised to die no more. It's not what Acts 26 says. It's not what 1 Corinthians 15 says. Paul's focus in 1 Corinthians 15 is on Jesus being the first to be raised out of Adamic death. What is the death of the garden? Boy, that's where we really get down to it, isn't it? Okay, God said to Adam and Eve, of every fruit of every tree that is in the garden you may freely eat. But of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you will not eat thereof, because, watch this, in the day that you eat thereof you will surely die. Let's put that another day. If you eat the fruit, the day you eat it, you're going to die. Okay. Sam Frost once believed that since it was obvious that Adam and Eve did not die biologically that day, that this meant the Father was speaking about spiritual death, i.e. separation from God. Well, in his video number 2, in his response to my response to him, Sam says, well, you see, what we have to understand is that although God threatened with them with biological physical death that day, that his gracious provision stepped in and he offered a substitutionary sacrifice, i.e. an animal. He killed the animal instead of Adam and Eve, and he put the animal skins on them, and thus forestalled their physical death. How many hundreds of years did Adam and Eve live after that? Wow, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, Sam Frost tells us the fact that they did not die that day is just simply a manifestation of God's grace to offer a substitutionary death, which of course points forward to Jesus. Well, we'll have something to say about the substitutionary death of Jesus at a later time, but here are some questions raised by Mr. Frost's explanation of why Adam and Eve did not drop dead that very day. His explanation, substitutionary death of the animal. Okay, let's see here. Was Adam and Eve cast out of the garden, cast out of the presence of God, the very day they ate? Well, of course they were. Okay, well, wait a minute. I want you to ask yourself the following question. If the substitutionary death of the animals that God killed instead of Adam and Eve prevented them from dying physically, biologically that very day, then why did not that same identical animal sacrifice not forestall their spiritual alienation from God that very day. If they did not die physically for well off into the future hundreds of years, why didn't they get to stay in the garden for that long? I mean, after all, spiritual death, physical death, Mr. Frost tells us, go together. That we cannot separate them. Listen, folks, if God carried through with His Word and cast Adam and Eve out of His presence, i.e. they died spiritually that very day, then that substitutionary death didn't do any good, did it? Spiritually. Why did the substitutionary death do good biologically, but it didn't do one whit of good spiritually? Trying to say, well, the reason they did not die physically is because of the substitutionary death, and yet then turn right around and to say, oh yes, they did die spiritually that day, is nothing but sophistry, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to be as kind as possible. But if you're going to argue, oh, physical death of an animal, substitution, you don't have to die for hundreds and hundreds of years physically, then it is a perfectly legitimate question to ask. If the death of that animal forestalled their physical death by hundreds and hundreds of years, then why then did not that same identical animal sacrifice forestall their separation from God, their being kicked out of the garden? We know they were kicked out of the garden that very day. They died spiritually that very day. The substitutionary death did them no good spiritually. And yet Mr. Frost tells us, hey, you can't separate man, spiritual and physical. They're combined. Well, if man is a spiritual and physical unity combined that you cannot separate, then the claim that the animal sacrifice was a substitutionary death, forestalling their physical death for hundreds of years, and yet did not one bit of good, not one moment's good for them spiritually, is a self-contradiction. At a closer examination, a continuing examination of Paul's doctrine of Christ the firstfruits proves that even more.